Going to be covering the reason why you're watching all these videos, right? The reason why, probably one of the reasons why you're learning economics, right? You want to get a 5 or at least a passing score on the AP exam. In my opinion, there's a 3-step method you can do to easily get a 5 on the exam. First, you gotta know the content. Plain and simple, it's the foundation of any sort of studying, whether that be AP Econ, AP Physics, or any sort of college class, or any sort of class in general. You need to know the content. For AP Econ, a lot of AP teachers tell you is econ, other classes, etc. There's some units that you don't need to study a lot. There's some units you have to study a lot. I disagree with that a lot on AP Econ especially. With AP Econ, you basically need to know everything. Literally everything. For a 5 on AP Micro and Macro exam, you need about an 80 to 85%. For a 4, you need about 75, and for a 3, about 65, maybe 70%, depending on the exam, obviously. So you need to basically know all of this. There's no one unit you can just slack off and not know. You need to know all of it. However, there's some units that are tested more heavily than others, obviously. For instance, in microeconomics, you'll notice unit 1, 2, 3, and 4 are the most tested. So most of the course, most of the exam is going to talk about your basic economic concepts, right? Comparative advantage, the PPC, supply and demand in unit 2, market structures and short-run cost curves, perfect competition, monopolies, monopolistic competitions and oligopolies. All of that is practically 80% of the exam. Some just those few economic concepts that you can easily master 80% of the exam. Unit 5 about labor markets, pretty low. You might be able to pass without knowing labor markets. Unit 6 about market failures, if there was a unit you could slack off in, it would be Unit 6. For macroeconomics, it's even better in my opinion. Most of the class boils down to fiscal and monetary policy. Unit 3, 4, and 5 all talk about fiscal, monetary policy, and its impacts. So you can see it's almost 50 to 70% of the test about fiscal and monetary policy and its applications. If you understand that, boom, you're basically on your way to get a 5. It's that simple. But you still need to know Unit 1, you still need to know Unit 2, GDP, inflation, unemployment, and Unit 6. But what's more important than just learning the content is you need to understand how everything actually works. And this is especially true for AP Econ compared to any other course. You need to understand how everything works, you need to understand why it's like that, and you need to understand how to actually apply it. For instance, you need to understand why a perfect competition graph and why marginal revenue equals to demand. You need to understand why it's horizontal. You need to understand the barriers to entry, right? You need to understand it conceptually, and you need to understand why the graphs are the way it is. That goes for almost every concept in AP Economics. It doesn't matter. You need to understand why it's like that. You need to understand how it's actually changing. Additionally, and what I see a lot of teachers not actually stress, is that you need to know the almost chain of impacts. For AP Macro especially, there's a huge chain of different economic indicators. For instance, let's say we have really high inflation, right? Well, the Federal Reserve are going to try to increase interest rates. When we raise interest rates, that decreases economic growth, so GDP decreases, unemployment increases. That's also an indicator of the Phillips curve, but a decrease in GDP, right? That reduces aggregate demand. A reduction in aggregate demand, that shows that price overall is going to decrease and quantity demanded will decrease. So you can see it's almost like a chain of impacts. Everything is connected. All those economic indicators are connected. So that's kind of what you need to understand. You need to understand it properly, right? You can't just mix up the two. You can't just say, oh, a reduction in inflation, that means that we're going to see higher interest rates. Not necessarily. So you need to understand it clearly, and you need to understand the entire chain almost. Then we have second and third step, which you can almost lump together. basically you need to go and you need to take a lot of questions. You need to do a lot of questions, and you need to do it well. You need to understand the testing, the types of questions, etc. I tell people it's almost like studying for the SAT and ACT. You need to do a lot of practice tests and questions because you gotta get accustomed to the question types. You gotta get accustomed to what they're going to ask you. You can't just be studying the content without actually doing the questions. In fact, when you're learning the content, when you're going through Unit 1 through 6, I highly recommend that you go towards the multiple choice questions. Like while you're learning, do multiple choice questions. While you're learning Unit 1, do questions based on Unit 1. While you're learning Unit 2, do questions based on Unit 1 and 2, etc., etc. You don't need to do the FRQs because the FRQs use all the units really. Most of them use a lot of units, but for the multiple choice, I really recommend while you're learning, do multiple choice questions. It makes this process way easier. So for the multiple choice, 66% of your score comes from multiple choice. You have 60 questions, you get 70 minutes. In my opinion, the best resource you can use, it's a website I made, econforstudents.com. All lowercase, econforstudents.com. Go towards it, and you can see different tabs. Let's go to practice tests. I believe the best way to learn, best way to get accumulated, best way to actually prepare, take practice tests. You can see a huge amount of practice tests here. I believe 3, 6, 9, 12, 14, 7 micro exams, 7 macro exams. That's pretty freaking high. So let's say we want to take AP Microeconomics, the 2012 practice exam. This is the exact exam they gave people in 2012. So it's pretty freaking accurate. They haven't changed much since. So you can see different question types. I recommend you get used to the timing. So time yourself. It's about a minute, maybe a minute 10 per question. Go through all these questions. Answer as much as you can. Do as well as you can. And then I recommend going towards the answers. Now, most of them won't have I don't think any of them have an answer explanation. They don't explain the answers, but you can go to ChatGPT, for instance, ask them for answers on a specific question. Now, it's not just, you don't just want to blindly be doing questions, right? You got to understand what you got wrong. You got to understand how you got it wrong. You got to understand the question type. I recommend after you do every practice exam, you go in a Google Doc, you write down the questions, you write down the practice exam you took. So for instance, this is the practice exam in 2012. So I write that down, then I write down the questions I got wrong. So let's say I got question 1, 2, and 3 wrong. Then I write number 1 with an X. I don't write anything else. And then I write the unit and the topic I got wrong. So for instance, this is talking about opportunity cost. So I would write unit 1 opportunity cost I got wrong. So it tells me the unit I should probably be studying and the topic I'm missing. Then for this question, let's say I got this one wrong. Well, I got that means I would write a unit 1 PPC. That's the concept I got wrong. That's a unit I got wrong. After you do maybe 1 or 2 practice exam, you're going to start noticing patterns. For instance, when I took AP Microeconomics, I believe 2-3 years ago, I did that exact same approach, and I started seeing, hey, I'm doing pretty well in Unit 1, 2, and 3, but I'm struggling on Unit 5 about the labor market. And those questions are typically pretty easy, so it's kind of a red flag. So then I started studying a lot more in Unit 5 labor market. So it's an easy way to identify where your weaknesses are and what you gotta basically improve on, right? After you do all of this, after you figure out what units you got to study more of, right, I recommend you go to the practice questions tab. This tab right here, there are plenty of practice questions, 200 plus, where you can cover all these different topics. For instance, this is AP Micro and Macro Unit 1. This is 20 plus questions all about AP Micro Unit 1. Now, these are very similar to the AP exam questions, but they're all Unit 1. They're very specific. They're almost all the question types you're going to see. All the question types you're going to see and answer explanations right here. Go through them, understand what you're getting wrong, go through them, try to get them right, obviously, in the time, ideally 1 to 2 minutes, and then boom. you're going to get everything, you're going to start improving if you're getting these question types right and you're understanding what you're doing wrong. It's as simple as that. Now it's the FRQs. In my opinion, I would go through the FRQs last. So after you go towards all the content, I would study for the multiple choice, both while you're learning, but and after. And then finally, I would go to the FRQs. 34% of your score comes from the FRQ. You have 3 questions in 1 hour, 1 long one with 50% of your score, and 2 short ones, each with 25%. I recommend for the long one, you take 35 minutes, and for the 2 short ones, you take 15 minutes, but you do as you do. So the best resource for this, you go onto Google, you type AP Micro or Macroeconomics FRQ. That's all you do. First link, AP Microeconomics exam questions from the College Board. And you'll notice there's a lot of different questions. Look at this. Nearly 26 years of free response questions. You click this, press this, and you get a complete set of free response questions given in 2025. Look at this. So you have a question about perfect competition, you have a question about supply and demand, and you have a question about oligopolies. Now, some topics I believe do come up more on FRQs than others. For instance, I feel like oligopolies come up a lot on FRQs. Same with supply and demand and market structures, but still, you need to know everything. In fact, some FRQs go really niche. I've seen FRQs before go into natural monopolies, right? Some really niche topics that not a lot of students actually know. In case you don't know a topic, just in my opinion, just bullshit. The AP graders are trying to give you as many points as possible. If you just write down something that sounds kind of right, there are actually a lot of instances where I've seen people get 1, 2, maybe even 3 points out of it, which is pretty great actually. You're basically getting most of the question right or partial credit, just even if you don't get any, even if you don't know it. In fact, even if you didn't know oligopolies, right, or you really didn't understand it, you could still get this question right if you just try your best and you bullshit and write whatever you need. So, in my opinion, try your hardest. Don't try your hardest. Make sure you understand the question, obviously. If you know the question, answer it to your best degree. But, in my opinion, a lot of the time, partial credit on these FRQs is pretty good. Now, you also want to answer the question specifically. For instance, let's say C. Suppose instead the government grants a per unit subsidy to Voda Reservoir. What will happen to Voda Reservoir's profit maximizing quantity of bottled water? Explain. Well, explain what will happen to Voda Reservoir's profit maximizing quantity. You don't really need to write a lot, just explain it. You can't just say it's going to increase or decrease. Explain it and make sure you understand it. Don't write about anything else. That's the basic foundation, the ideas behind FRQs. Now, if you study FRQs, MCQs, and you know the content, you're almost guaranteed to get at least a 4 or a 5. AP Micro and Macro are relatively tough exams. In fact, you need around 80-85%. But if you know the concepts, if you do a lot of questions, I believe anyone can get a 4 or 5.